You know, I remember a conversation I had once with an older gentleman, a quiet man who had seen a lot of life. We were talking about family, about the bonds that tie us together, and the pain when those bonds shatter. He leaned forward, his eyes distant, and said, "There's nothing quite like the grief of a parent who's lost a child, but it's a different kind of wound when that child turns against you. It's a betrayal that gnaws at the soul, a death that begins long before the body falls." His words struck me then, and they echo even louder now as we delve into one of the most agonizing, psychologically brutal deaths in all of biblical history, the death of Absalom, the Golden Prince, the betrayer of his own father, King David. His end was swift, gruesome, and steeped in a tragedy so profound it still resonates thousands of years later. But what if everything you thought you knew about Absalom's final moments, the very how of his death, is merely scratching the surface of a much deeper, more disturbing truth? What if the official story hides a shocking layer of premeditation, a cold, calculated justice delivered not by God, but by man? Prepare yourself, because when you hear what really happened in those final, desperate moments, your understanding of betrayal, fatherhood, and the ruthless nature of power will be irrevocably changed. Before we can even begin to understand the horrifying end of Absalom, we must first immerse ourselves in the tumultuous world he inhabited, a world defined by the glory and the grievous flaws of his father, King David. Imagine a kingdom, newly forged from tribal disunity, brought to unprecedented heights by a charismatic shepherd boy turned warrior king. David, the man after God's own heart, a poet, a conqueror, a deeply spiritual man, yet also a man haunted by his own colossal failures. He ruled from Jerusalem, a city he had claimed as his capital, a place pulsating with power, intrigue, and the ever-present shadow of human ambition. Absalom was not just any son, he was David's third son, born of Maacah, a princess from Geshur. From birth, he was marked by extraordinary beauty. The scriptures tell us there was no blemish in him from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He was the epitome of royal charisma, with a luxurious mane of hair that was famously heavy when cut. This wasn't just physical attractiveness, it was a magnetic aura that drew people to him, an almost preternatural ability to charm and persuade. But underneath this radiant exterior, a darkness was brewing, a tempest of resentment, ambition, and a thirst for vengeance that would ultimately consume him and tear his family apart. Now, you might be wondering how such a beloved son, a prince of such promise, could ever conceive of betraying his own father, the very king of Israel. This is where the story takes a dark turn, revealing the festering wounds within David's royal household that set the stage for Absalom's tragic fate. The first deep cut was not directly Absalom's doing, but it was a catalyst, a spark that ignited his fury and fueled his ambition. This was the horrific rape of his full sister, Tamar, by their half-brother, Amnon. Can you imagine the outrage, the violation, the shame that tore through that family? Tamar was Absalom's twin sister, his blood, his beloved kin. And Amnon, the heir apparent, David's firstborn, had committed this abominable act. What happened next, or rather, what didn't happen, laid the psychological groundwork for Absalom's future rebellion. David, for all his righteousness and wisdom, was paralyzed by inaction. He heard of his son's crime, and he was very angry, but he did nothing. No justice for Tamar, no punishment for Amnon. This shocking lack of intervention from the king, from the father who was supposed to be the protector and enforcer of justice, left a gaping wound in Absalom's heart. It spoke volumes about David's complex character, a man capable of profound devotion, but also of devastating passivity when faced with difficult family matters. For 2 long years, Absalom harbored this bitter resentment, this burning desire for retribution, silently watching, waiting. The Bible paints a chilling picture of his calculated patience. Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Think about the psychological weight of that silence. It wasn't forgiveness, it was a cold, simmering fury, a meticulously planned revenge. This is the part that changes everything about how we see this death, revealing Absalom not just as an ambitious prince, but as a man shaped by profound trauma and a deep sense of unavenged injustice. He bided his time, inviting Amnon to a sheep-shearing feast, a deceptive invitation veiled in hospitality. What witnesses actually saw was the culmination of his festering rage. As Amnon was merry with wine, Absalom gave the command to his servants, "Strike Amnon down and kill him. Do not be afraid. Have not I commanded you? Be strong and courageous." In that moment, Absalom transformed from a grieving brother into a cold-blooded killer, exacting his own brutal justice where his father had failed. This act, while fueled by legitimate grievance, was a crossing of a line, a usurpation of the king's prerogative of justice, and it set him on an irreversible path towards conflict with David. This shocking truth historians discovered about Absalom's character, this capacity for both deep affection and ruthless violence, is crucial to understanding the man who would eventually challenge his father for the throne. After Amnon's murder, Absalom fled, finding refuge with his maternal grandfather, Talmai, the king of Geshur. 3 years he lived in exile, a prince without a kingdom, a son separated from his father. David, we are told, mourned for his son day after day. This period reveals the torturous dilemma David faced, the love for his son warring with the consequences of his son's actions. It was Joab, David's shrewd and often brutal military commander, who saw the strategic and emotional stalemate. Joab, ever the pragmatist, understood the king's yearning for his son's return, and he orchestrated a clever ruse involving a wise woman from Tekoa to subtly influence David to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. But here's the crucial detail, a knowledge gap that's often overlooked. Even after his return, Absalom was not allowed into David's presence for 2 full years. 2 more years of living in the same city, yet separated by an invisible but impenetrable wall of paternal pain and mistrust. Can you imagine the psychological impact of that continued rejection? The beautiful, charismatic prince, living in isolation, stewing in his own thoughts, the initial relief of return giving way to a new, bitter resentment. This silent treatment, this prolonged exclusion from the royal presence, chipped away at Absalom's patience and fostered the fertile ground for his rebellion. The tension in Jerusalem must have been palpable. Every day, the handsome prince was seen in the city, but never at the king's side. It was during this period that Absalom began his insidious campaign to steal the hearts of the men of Israel. He didn't openly challenge David at first, instead, he adopted a cunning, manipulative strategy. He would rise early, stand by the city gate, the very place where legal disputes were heard. When people came to the king for justice, Absalom would intercept them. He'd listen to their complaints, express sympathy, and then, with a masterstroke of political theater, he would lament the king's perceived inaccessibility. "See," he'd say, "your claims are good and right, but there is no one deputed by the king to hear you." Then, with an air of faux humility and profound concern for the common man, he would declare, "Oh, that I would judge in the land. Then everyone who has a suit or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." This was a carefully calculated move, exploiting the perceived weaknesses in David's administration, tapping into the grievances of the populace, and presenting himself as the accessible, just alternative. This death changed history in ways you never imagined, showing how a charismatic individual can undermine a throne not with swords, but with words and perceived empathy. Now, you might be wondering how this slow, quiet subversion escalated into a full-blown civil war. It was a gradual erosion of trust, a creeping poison that spread through the kingdom. Absalom didn't just talk, he acted the part of a future king. He acquired chariots and horses, and 50 men to run ahead of him, a display of royal pomp traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch. This was a clear signal, a blatant challenge to David's authority, yet David, perhaps still weighed down by his own guilt and weary from his past transgressions, seemed tragically blind or unwilling to confront the growing threat within his own house. This period of quiet rebellion, of open disregard for protocol, demonstrates a profound knowledge gap in how we often perceive such uprisings. It wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow burn, fueled by cunning and a deep understanding of human psychology. Absalom understood that power wasn't just taken, it was cultivated, won over in the hearts and minds of the people, one grievance at a time. The reason this death story was hidden for centuries from popular understanding, in terms of its psychological nuance, is because it challenges the simplistic notions of good versus evil, revealing the complex interplay of ambition, unresolved trauma, and the crushing weight of royal responsibility. Eventually, after 4 years of this calculated campaign, Absalom felt strong enough to make his move. He requested permission from David to go to Hebron, ostensibly to fulfill a vow he had made to the Lord. Hebron was not just any city, it was where David himself had first been anointed king. It was a symbolic power play, a deliberate echo of David's own rise. David, still tragically unaware of the depth of his son's betrayal, granted him leave. But here's the shocking truth historians discovered: Absalom had already sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, instructing them, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. This was a meticulously planned coup, a declaration of war against his own father. 200 men from Jerusalem, who were invited guests and knew nothing of Absalom's true intentions, went with him. They were unwitting pawns in his grand scheme. But the most devastating blow to David, perhaps even more painful than Absalom's direct rebellion, was the defection of Ahithophel. Ahithophel was David's most trusted counselor, renowned for his wisdom, his advice considered as if one inquired of God. His betrayal was a seismic shock, a profound wound to David's soul, suggesting that even his closest confidants could be swayed by the charismatic, ruthless ambition of Absalom. This is the part that changes everything about how we see this death. It wasn't just a physical rebellion, it was a psychological dismantling of David's world, one trusted person at a time. When news finally reached David in Jerusalem that the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom, the speed and scale of the betrayal must have been terrifying. What history books don't tell you about this death is the profound sense of isolation and despair that must have gripped David in that moment. His own son, his trusted advisor, his kingdom turning against him. David, recognizing the futility of resistance in the capital, knowing that if he stayed, Absalom would likely attack the city and spare no one, made the agonizing decision to flee. This was not a retreat of cowardice, but a strategic and deeply painful evacuation. He left Jerusalem with his loyal household, a small contingent of Philistine mercenaries from Gath who had remarkably remained faithful to him, and the Levites bearing the Ark of the Covenant. This procession, as they ascended the Mount of Olives, weeping as they went, David's head covered, his feet bare in a sign of mourning and humiliation, is one of the most poignant scenes in the Old Testament. It shows the mighty King David, humbled, exposed, paying the price for his past sins and the fractured state of his family. His vulnerability in that moment created an open loop in the minds of those who watched him leave. Would the king ever return? Could he ever reclaim his throne? As David fled, he encountered several figures who further illustrate the complex human drama surrounding Absalom's rebellion. There was Ittai the Gittite, the commander of the Philistine guard, who famously declared his unwavering loyalty, "Wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." This kind of steadfast devotion against a tide of betrayal provides a stark contrast to Absalom's perfidy and offers a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. Then there was Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, attempting to bring the Ark of the Covenant with them. David, in an act of profound faith and submission, told them to return the Ark to Jerusalem, trusting that if he found favor in the eyes of the Lord, God would bring him back to see it again. This act of faith, amid such profound humiliation and uncertainty, speaks volumes about David's character and provides a moment of powerful oxytocin release for the viewer, a connection through shared vulnerability and the hope of divine intervention. But here's where the tension builds. As David was on his way, he received word of Ahithophel's defection, and his immediate prayer was for God to turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. This prayer, a direct appeal to divine intervention against a specific human betrayal, shows the depth of David's distress and his reliance on a power beyond his own. To counter Ahithophel's formidable intellect, David devised a desperate plan, rooted in his understanding of human nature and political strategy. He sent his loyal friend Hushai the Archite, known as the king's friend, back to Jerusalem. His mission? To pretend loyalty to Absalom and then, crucially, to undermine Ahithophel's counsel. This was a high-stakes psychological game, a battle of wits and deception being played out even as David was literally fleeing for his life. And it worked. Ahithophel advised Absalom to pursue David immediately, while David was weary and disheartened, and strike him down alone. It was a brilliant, ruthless plan that would have decapitated the rebellion quickly. But Absalom, perhaps swayed by a sense of youthful bravado or divine intervention, also consulted Hushai. Hushai, playing his part to perfection, painted a picture of David as a formidable warrior, a lioness robbed of her cubs, ready to fight with fierce desperation. He advised Absalom to gather the entire nation, an immense army, so that he could personally lead them to victory, ensuring Absalom's glory. This was a delay tactic, a strategic error that proved fatal for Absalom. The Bible tells us that the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. This is a crucial point for understanding the concept of divine judgment versus human agency in this narrative. Was it divine justice being served, or simply the natural consequence of human pride and delay? The immediate consequence of Hushai's successful deception was the tragic suicide of Ahithophel. When he saw that his counsel had been rejected in favor of Hushai's, he knew that Absalom's rebellion was doomed. He recognized the strategic blunder, the window of opportunity lost. This is where the story takes a dark turn, illustrating the dire consequences of political failure in that brutal era. Ahithophel, a man of immense wisdom, went home, set his house in order, and hanged himself. It was an act of despair, a final, chilling statement about the absolute nature of his betrayal and the inescapable outcome he foresaw. His death, often overlooked, highlights the immense stakes involved in this conflict and the psychological pressure on those caught in its web. It leaves an open loop. Was Ahithophel's suicide an act of hubris, despair, or a twisted final act of loyalty to a cause he believed was right, now irrevocably lost? This is a pattern interrupt, reminding us that Absalom's story is intertwined with the fates of many others. But here's the shocking truth historians discovered: Hushai's delay allowed David time. Time to cross the Jordan River, time to establish a new base, time to gather his forces, and most importantly, time for news to reach David about Absalom's true intentions and the scale of his army. The stage was now set for the final, bloody confrontation. David organized his relatively smaller, but fiercely loyal, army into 3 divisions, placing them under the command of Joab, Abishai, Joab's brother, and Ittai the Gittite. As they prepared for battle, David, despite everything, issued a heartbreaking command to his generals: "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." This simple instruction reveals the profound, conflicting emotions of a father who, even in the face of betrayal and armed rebellion, still harbored a deep, undying love for his rebellious son. It's a moment that triggers a powerful oxytocin release, as we connect with the universal pain of parental love and loss, even when that love is tested to its absolute limits. This is the part that changes everything about how we see this death. It wasn't just a battle between 2 armies, it was a father agonizing over the life of his son, even as that son sought his destruction. This internal conflict within David builds incredible psychological tension, a morbid curiosity about how this impossible situation would resolve itself. Would David's command be honored? Could Absalom truly be spared? The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, a treacherous, dense woodland that proved to be Absalom's undoing. This was no ordinary battlefield. Its thickets and ravines were as much an enemy as David's seasoned troops. The scriptures tell us that the battle was spread over the face of all the country, suggesting a chaotic, disorienting engagement where individual soldiers fought in isolated skirmishes amidst the dense foliage. And in this brutal, disorienting landscape, Absalom, mounted on his mule, found himself in a desperate situation. Now, you might be wondering how exactly Absalom, the king's son, with his grand army, ended up in such a vulnerable position. This is where the story reaches its chilling climax, revealing the precise, almost bizarre circumstances of his death. Absalom was riding through the thick forest when his famous, abundant hair, the very symbol of his physical beauty and perhaps his pride, got caught in the branches of a large terebinth tree. His mule rode on from under him, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth, hanging helplessly by his hair. This unexpected death detail is a profound pattern interrupt, a moment of startling vulnerability for a figure who had projected such strength and charisma. Imagine the scene, the cacophony of battle all around, swords clashing, men crying out, and there, suspended, is the beautiful prince, utterly helpless. A soldier, seeing Absalom in this grotesque predicament, immediately went to Joab, the commander-in-chief, and reported what he had seen. This is a crucial point, highlighting the open loop of authority and responsibility in military conflict. What would Joab do with this information, given David's explicit command to deal gently with Absalom? The soldier himself expressed his hesitation, telling Joab, "If you had given me 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not have put out my hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Protect for me the young man Absalom. This reveals a deep moral conflict, a recognition of David's authority and his paternal anguish, even among the ranks. But Job, ever the cold pragmatist, saw only the strategic necessity. He was not bound by David's emotional plea in the way the common soldier might be. His duty was to the stability of the kingdom, which Absalom's continued existence threatened. This is a knowledge gap exploited, showing the brutal logic of war overriding personal sentiment. Job's response was swift and merciless. I will not waste time with you, Job declared, and in a shocking act of defiance to David's command, he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth. But it didn't end there. As if to ensure his death, and perhaps to share the grim responsibility, 10 young men who were Job's armor-bearers gathered around Absalom and struck him, finishing him off. This graphic and brutal detail is the moment of death revelation, delivered with maximum impact. It was not a clean, honorable death in battle, it was a merciless execution, a deliberate act carried out by David's own commander, in direct contravention of David's expressed wishes. The method of his death, caught by his distinctive hair and then brutally dispatched, adds a layer of ironic, almost poetic justice, considering his famous beauty and pride. This sequence triggers a powerful neurochemical response, a mix of shock and a complicated sense of justice. Was it divine judgment for his rebellion, or simply the grim, unavoidable consequence of Job's ruthless pragmatism? The answer remains an open loop, inviting deeper reflection. With Absalom dead, Job signaled for the trumpets to sound, calling off the pursuit of Absalom's fleeing army. He understood that the war was effectively over, the rebellion decapitated. Absalom's body was then taken and thrown into a large pit in the forest, and a very large heap of stones was piled over him. This was not a king's burial, it was the burial of a common criminal, a final act of humiliation for the once proud prince. It stands in stark contrast to Absalom's own monument, which he had erected for himself in the king's valley during his lifetime, declaring, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. A grim irony, indeed, that the man who had built a monument to perpetuate his name would be buried in an unmarked pit under a pile of stones, his memory condemned. This particular detail of his burial is often overlooked, but it is deeply symbolic of his tragic fall and the ultimate futility of his rebellious ambition. It's a powerful lesson in mortality salience, even the most ambitious and charismatic can fall to ignominy. The immediate aftermath of Absalom's death plunged David into a profound and inconsolable grief. The news reached David through 2 runners, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok the priest, and a Cushite messenger. David's first and only question to each was, is it well with the young man Absalom? When the Cushite finally delivered the devastating news, albeit indirectly, that the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man, David understood. His reaction was not relief, not satisfaction at the end of the rebellion, but a heart-wrenching lament that echoes through history, "Oh my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." This public display of grief, the king weeping uncontrollably, going up to the chamber over the gate and crying out, reveals the depths of his parental love, a love that transcended the betrayal. It's a powerful moment of oxytocin release, drawing viewers into David's universal pain, connecting through the shared experience of loss and the agony of a parent's broken heart. His tears were not just for Absalom, but for the shattered hope of his family, for the cost of his own past mistakes, and for the tragic cycle of violence and betrayal that seemed to plague his house. David's excessive grief, however, became a problem for his victorious army. They returned to the city, not with joy and celebration, but with a sense of shame and humiliation, as if they had been defeated. They heard the king weeping for the very man who had sought to destroy him and usurp his throne. This created a dangerous psychological tension, threatening to unravel the fragile peace that had just been won. This is where Job, once again, stepped in with his brutal pragmatism. He confronted David, not with comfort, but with harsh, unvarnished truth. You have today put to shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, Job declared. He bluntly told David that he loved his enemies and hated his friends, and that if David did not show himself to his people, they would abandon him that very night. This was a pattern interrupt in David's grief, a shocking dose of reality from his loyal but ruthless commander. Job forced David to choose between his personal grief and his responsibility as king. And David, though still heartbroken, listened. He rose, went to the gate, and showed himself to his people, gradually beginning the process of healing and rebuilding his shattered kingdom. The meaning and legacy of Absalom's death extend far beyond the immediate events. Psychologically, his story is a profound exploration of ambition unchecked, the devastating consequences of unresolved family trauma, and the insidious nature of betrayal. Absalom's ambition, fueled by a thirst for vengeance and perhaps a sense of entitlement that stemmed from his royal lineage and striking appearance, ultimately consumed him. His charisma became a tool for manipulation, his charm a weapon of subversion. His life serves as a stark moral lesson, the pursuit of power for its own sake, especially when it involves tearing down those who are meant to be cherished, leads only to destruction. His death wasn't just the end of a rebellion, it was the tragic culmination of a broken family, a father's sins visited upon his children, and the painful reality that sometimes, justice comes not as a clear vindication, but as a devastating, unavoidable consequence. This historical insight offers a critical perspective often missed. Absalom's story is a mirror reflecting the universal human struggle with pride, envy, and the desperate longing for recognition, even if it means tearing down established order. For David, Absalom's death marked the end of a rebellion, but the beginning of a new, profound chapter of grief and introspection. His lament for Absalom is one of the most powerful expressions of paternal sorrow in all literature, transcending the specific historical context to touch a universal chord. It reminds us that even kings are human, vulnerable to the deepest emotional wounds. David's reaction to Absalom's death highlights the complex nature of biblical justice and divine judgment. Was Absalom's death God's punishment for his rebellion? Or was it the tragic, but inevitable, outcome of his choices, an example of consequences unfolding in a world where human agency plays a significant role? The narrative leaves this open to interpretation, triggering deeper reflection on divine sovereignty versus free will. The pile of stones over Absalom's body stands as a permanent, chilling testament to the fate of those who betray, a silent warning echoing through the ages. Yet, the story also offers a glimmer of hope. In David's eventual return to leadership, his struggle to find meaning in the midst of overwhelming sorrow, and his continued reliance on God amidst the wreckage of his personal life. What history books don't tell you about this death is how deeply it shaped David's remaining reign, forcing him to confront his own past failures and to truly grapple with the price of his throne. The deeper reflection on Absalom's death brings us to a profound understanding of justice, not always as swift or satisfying as we might wish, but often as a gradual, agonizing unfolding of consequences. Absalom's rebellion was an act of profound injustice against his father, against the established order, and against the peace of the kingdom. That justice served, in a cosmic sense, was the rebellion's failure and Absalom's tragic end. But it was a justice steeped in sorrow, a victory that felt like a defeat for David. There was no vindication for the martyr here, because Absalom was no martyr, he was a tragic figure, consumed by his own ambition and unresolved pain. The vindication was for David's ultimate restoration to his throne, not a joyful one, but a necessary one for the continuity of the kingdom. And what happened to the killers, to Job and his men? Job, despite his ruthless pragmatism, was critical to David's survival and the kingdom's stability. He faced David's initial anger but continued to serve as his commander. His actions, while defying the king's explicit command, were driven by a brutal sense of loyalty to the crown and to the greater good of Israel. This complex dynamic presents a powerful open loop. Was Job a villain or a necessary evil? Was his action an example of human ruthlessness or divine allowance for a specific, painful outcome? The story forces us to grapple with the messy realities of power, loyalty, and the often uncomfortable truth that sometimes, the right outcome comes from morally ambiguous actions. This entire saga, from the initial seed of resentment to Absalom's final, ignominious burial, serves as a powerful testament to the destructive nature of unchecked ambition and the enduring pain of familial betrayal. It's a story that compels us to look inward, to examine the unseen resentments that can fester in our own hearts, and to recognize the devastating ripple effect of our actions, not just on ourselves, but on those we claim to love. The story of Absalom is more than just a historical account, It's a psychological drama, a chilling reminder that the greatest battles are often fought not on a battlefield, but within the confines of our own families, within the very chambers of our hearts. It forces us to confront the profound truth that sometimes, the most painful deaths are not merely physical, but the slow, agonizing demise of trust, love, and loyalty. And as we close this chapter on Absalom, the prince who sought to usurp his father's throne and found only a bitter, unceremonious end, we are left with the lingering echoes of David's sorrow, a king who had won countless battles but lost the war for his family's soul. The complexities of Absalom's death, the political intrigue, the personal betrayals, the chilling final moments, offer a stark window into the human condition. It's a story that leaves us with more than just answers, it leaves us with profound questions about fate, free will, and the inescapable consequences of our choices. But David's story, for all its tragedy, doesn't end here. His reign was marked by yet more dramatic twists, more betrayals, more heart-wrenching losses, and even more surprising acts of divine intervention. One of the most fascinating characters whose life was inextricably linked to David's, a man of incredible wisdom and influence, suffered an equally mysterious and impactful end, intertwined with his loyalty to the very throne Absalom sought to destroy. His death involved a cryptic message, a swift execution, and a profound shift in the balance of power. Next time, we'll peel back the layers on the death of this enigmatic figure, a death that cemented Solomon's reign and concluded David's turbulent legacy with one final, decisive stroke.